The story began in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where every detail was dictated by the watchful eye of the homeowners association. Lawns were cut to identical lengths, hedges were trimmed with military precision, and front porches displayed the same cookie-cutter decorations from one end of the block to the other. It was the type of place where conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. And while most residents submitted without question, there was always one person who found themselves at the center of the HOA's next crusade. That person, in this case, was the homeowner who loved cats more than anything else. They weren't exotic animals, they weren't loud or destructive. They were simply a collection of well-cared-for pets. Soft, playful and adored, the cats brought warmth to the home and became familiar faces along the block. Neighbors' children would stop on their way to school to pet them. Delivery drivers would chuckle as a curious paw peeked through the front window. And the cats themselves lounged lazily in the sun, perfectly content. But in a neighborhood governed by rigid rules, even something as simple as owning pets could become a problem. The HOA board had long been dominated by those who valued appearances above everything else. To them, cats wandering near a fence line or resting in a patch of sun on the driveway were not harmless creatures. They were violations waiting to be catalogued. It started subtly, with notes slipped into the mailbox. The language was stern yet impersonal, citing clauses and bylaws about outdoor animals and community uniformity. The cats were accused of being a nuisance, of disturbing the harmony of the neighborhood, of compromising property values. These claims had no basis in reality. The cats did not damage property. They did not create noise and they did not trespass beyond the casual stroll along the sidewalk. But the HOA saw an opportunity to assert control, and they seized it. As the weeks passed, the pressure intensified. Letters became fines, and fines became threats of legal escalation. Meetings were held where certain members, most notably the sharp-tongued figures who thrived on enforcing rules, insisted that cats had no place in their pristine development. They spoke of allergies, of safety, of imagined problems that painted the animals as villains rather than companions. It was here that the central conflict took root. On one side was the homeowner, who loved and cared for their pets deeply. On the other was the HOA, armed with bylaws, threats, and an unshakable need to dominate. What could have remained a small disagreement quickly escalated into a full-blown standoff. The first chapter of this battle wasn't fought with lawyers or contractors. It was fought with quiet defiance. The cats remained, their presence a symbol of resistance against the HOA's overreach. Neighbors began to notice the tension. Some whispered support, sympathizing with the unfairness of the situation. Others sided with the board, muttering about rules being rules, even when those rules bordered on absurd. Day by day, the situation grew more ridiculous. The HOA demanded leashes on cats, as though they were dogs. They argued that cats should be confined indoors at all times. They even floated the idea of removing them entirely, as though pets that brought joy to a family could simply be erased to satisfy the desires of a few board members. But the homeowner refused to surrender. Instead of giving in, they began to plan. If the HOA claimed the cats were not welcome as ordinary pets, then they would become something more, something too grand, too visible, and too supported by the community to be ignored. It was during one particularly heated exchange with the board that the seed of an idea took root. The HOA wanted the cats gone because they disrupted the neighborhood's uniform look. But what if, instead of hiding them, the homeowner showcased them? What if, rather than concealing their presence, they celebrated them in a way that turned the HOA's petty rules into a stage for something extraordinary? That's when the idea of building something special, something beyond a scratching post or a cozy corner inside the house, began to form. It wouldn't just be a shelter or a small play area. It would be a structure so impressive that the cats would no longer be dismissed as nuisances. Instead, they would be recognized as residents in their own right, complete with a home designed especially for them. The early sketches were modest, a small outdoor house with windows, a roof and space for the cats to lounge safely. But as the pressure from the HOA increased, so did the ambition of the design. What began as a simple project grew into a vision, a miniature mansion crafted with care and creativity, a place where the cats could thrive openly and visibly. The plan was bold. By building a cat mansion, The homeowner could not only provide a safe and luxurious space for their pets, but also transform the HOA's narrative. No longer could they claim the cats were a problem when the animals lived in a dedicated structure that adhered to property lines and safety standards. And more importantly, the spectacle of such a project would draw attention far beyond the HOA's reach. Neighbors who once rolled their eyes at the conflict began to take interest. Some offered encouragement, curious to see what would come of the idea. Others, particularly those tired of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, saw it as a chance to challenge the board's authority indirectly. The more the HOA pushed, the more momentum the project gained. Soon the preparations began in earnest. Materials were researched, designs were refined, and spaces in the yard were measured with precision. This wasn't going to be a simple hobby project tucked away in a corner. It was going to be a statement, bold, undeniable, and impossible for the HOA to ignore. The homeowner understood the risks. The HOA would fight back. They would send letters, issue fines, and threaten action. But the goal was no longer just about keeping the cats. It was about standing against a system that sought to dictate every choice, every detail, every shred of individuality in the neighborhood. As the first chapter of this saga closed, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The HOA believed they were winning, that their intimidation would force the cats indoors or drive them away entirely. What they didn't realize was that their overreach had sparked something far greater than they could control. The cats remained calm, unaware of the storm brewing around them. They stretched lazily in patches of sunlight, tails flicking gently, as though mocking the chaos unfolding among the humans. To them, nothing had changed, but to the homeowner, everything had. The project was no longer an idea, it was a mission. The ground had been measured, the materials were being gathered, and the first foundations of defiance were ready to be laid. The HOA had tried to ban cats. Soon they would find themselves facing something far more extraordinary. A mansion built not for people but for the very pets they had tried to erase. And as construction prepared to begin, the stage was set for the next chapter in the battle. A clash not just of rules and bylaws, but of creativity, resilience, and the power of turning pettiness into pride. The morning construction began. The neighborhood felt different. The quiet, controlled air of suburban sameness cracked under the sound of hammers, the scrape of wood, and the determined pace of a homeowner who refused to back down. To the HOA, it was an offense, an act of rebellion taking form before their eyes. To the neighbors, it was a spectacle, one that carried the promise of something far greater than the rigid conformity they had lived under for years. The first phase was small enough to pass as innocuous. Wooden frames were laid out in the yard, simple outlines that might have been mistaken for a shed or a playhouse. But those who looked closely could already see the ambition behind the work. This wasn't the skeleton of a storage unit. The beams extended longer, the angles sharper, the design more intricate. Even in its earliest form, the project hinted at something unusual, something not entirely human in purpose. The HOA noticed immediately. Members strolled by, pretending to walk their dogs, eyes narrowing as they took in the rising frame. Notes began arriving again, sharp reminders about unapproved construction, unsanctioned exterior changes, and potential violations of neighborhood standards. They cited bylaws, ordinances, and every clause they could dig up from their thick binders of control. But the homeowner was prepared. Each step of the process had been researched carefully. Permits were checked, codes were reviewed, and every technicality had been considered. While the HOA could threaten, they had no real authority to stop construction that complied with city regulations. Their words, though loud, had no legal weight. The work continued. Walls went up, painted in warm, welcoming tones that stood out against the sterile beige palette of the neighborhood. Windows were installed, small arched openings that would allow cats to peer outside while remaining safe indoors. A balcony stretched across the upper level, designed with railings low enough for feline lounging, but high enough for security. The design was whimsical, almost fairy tale-like, yet practical in every detail. It was more than a shelter. It was a mansion, a place that reflected thought, creativity, and love. A place that said loudly without words that the cats were not nuisances, but cherished residents deserving of a home as dignified as any humans. The cats themselves seemed to sense the transformation. As the structure took shape, they perched nearby, eyes following every movement. Their curiosity was boundless. They sniffed at planks of wood, batted at dangling strings, and lounged in the shade cast by the rising frame. To them, it was not a political statement or a challenge to authority. It was simply a new adventure, a puzzle unfolding before their eyes. The HOA board, however, was not amused. Their meetings grew tense, voices rising as they debated strategy. Some demanded immediate legal intervention. Others fretted about the optics of targeting something as harmless as cats. But the loudest voices, the ones who craved control most, insisted that action must be taken. They drafted letters filled with threats, fines, and ultimatums. They leaned heavily on intimidation, hoping to wear down the resolve that fueled the project. Yet, every letter was met with silence. Every fine was ignored. Every ultimatum was disregarded. The homeowner had learned something powerful. The HOA's threats were only as strong as the fear they produced. Remove that fear, and their power crumbled like dust. Meanwhile, the mansion continued to rise. A second floor was added, complete with miniature staircases designed for small paws. Inside, platforms and ramps were built into the walls, creating a vertical playground that stretched from floor to ceiling. Outside, climbing posts and shaded alcoves were added, blending utility with charm. The design was intricate yet functional, a masterpiece of both architecture and affection. As word spread, the neighborhood began to shift. What started as whispers of curiosity grew into open fascination. Children pressed against fences, wide-eyed as the mansion grew taller each day. Parents lingered on sidewalks, pretending to check their phones while sneaking glances at the progress. Even those who typically avoided conflict found themselves quietly rooting for the project. The turning point came when the first neighbors openly voiced support. A family from 2 houses down brought over a bag of cat toys, laughing as they explained that their children couldn't wait to see the finished mansion. Another neighbor offered scrap materials, eager to contribute. Soon, what had been a solitary act of defiance transformed into a community effort. The HOA seethed. They had expected the homeowner to be isolated, beaten down by rules and regulations. Instead, they found themselves facing not just one individual, but an entire neighborhood rallying around the project. Their attempts to divide and control backfired spectacularly. By the time the roof was placed, the mansion had become a symbol. It was no longer just about cats, it was about choice, creativity, and resistance against arbitrary power. Neighbors began referring to it casually as the Cat Mansion, a name that stuck quickly and spread even further. One evening, as construction lights illuminated the nearly finished structure, a group of teenagers from the next block gathered to take photos. They posed in front of the glowing mansion, laughing and sharing the images online. Within hours, those photos began circulating beyond the neighborhood. What had been a local curiosity now started to attract wider attention. The HOA panicked. With each passing day, their control slipped further. They tried to escalate, contacting city officials and attempting to frame the mansion as unsafe or non-compliant. But inspections revealed nothing out of order. Every nail, every beam, every paint stroke was within regulation. The homeowner had been meticulous. The HOA had no legal footing. The cats moved in shortly after the final touches were complete. Their reactions were immediate and joyous. They darted up staircases, leapt onto balconies, curled into alcoves, and gazed out of arched windows with regal calm. For them, it was paradise. For the homeowner, it was vindication. For the neighborhood, it was entertainment, joy, and something to rally around. But the HOA wasn't finished. If they couldn't tear down the mansion through rules or fines, they would attempt to undermine it through narrative. They spread rumors about health risks, about potential noise, about property values supposedly plummeting. They sent out newsletters filled with dire warnings, hoping to scare neighbors into withdrawing support. Yet the opposite happened. Instead of fear, there was laughter. Instead of anger, there was admiration. The more the HOA tried to paint the mansion as a problem, the more people saw it as a triumph. Visitors began arriving from outside the community, curious to see the now famous cat mansion. Cars slowed as drivers craned their necks for a glimpse. Pedestrians stopped to take photos, sharing them online with captions filled with amusement and admiration. The HOA had intended to make an example of the homeowner. Instead, they had created a legend. As the second chapter drew to a close, the dynamic of the neighborhood had shifted permanently. The HOA was no longer feared, their threats rendered hollow. The cats, once the target of petty complaints, had become celebrities in their own right, and the mansion, standing proudly in the yard, was no longer just a structure. It was a monument to resilience, individuality, and the refusal to bow to petty tyranny. The battle, however, wasn't over. The HOA had lost control, but they hadn't given up. Their next moves would be desperate, dramatic, and designed to reclaim the power slipping from their grasp. The question was no longer whether the cats could stay. It was how far the HOA was willing to go, and how spectacularly their efforts would backfire. The neighborhood was no longer the same quiet cul-de-sac it had been a few months earlier. What began as a rigid attempt by the Homeowners Association to suppress something as harmless as cats had spiraled into a saga that captivated not only the residents, but people far beyond the boundaries of the community. The miniature mansion built for the cats had become the defining landmark of the area, and the whispers of disapproval that once followed the project were now drowned out by admiration, fascination, and a touch of envy. By this time, the mansion had been fully furnished. Every detail inside reflected care, creativity, and charm. A velvet-lined stairway spiraled to a loft space where the cats often perched like royalty, surveying their kingdom. Windows were cut low so the animals could peer outside, and lantern-style lamps illuminated the exterior in the evenings, casting a gentle glow across the lawn. The mosaic tiling on the miniature porch caught the light of the morning sun, creating a kaleidoscope of color that spilled across the grass. It looked more like a fairy tale cottage than a mere playhouse for pets. Naturally, the HOA could not let the matter rest. Their leadership, still embarrassed by how their earlier threats had turned into a viral spectacle, clung desperately to the notion that order and control were slipping from their hands. They saw the growing attention, the visitors snapping pictures in front of the mansion, and the local news stories painting the homeowner as a hero against needless restrictions, and it stung them. They began drafting formal letters, citing obscure rules about unapproved structures, property aesthetics, and unauthorized accessory buildings. Yet, with each attempt to regain control, they were met by the tide of public opinion, which was not in their favor. Residents who had once kept their distance now found themselves drawn to the property, charmed by the cats and curious to see the tiny palace for themselves. Some brought their children to marvel at it. Others slipped treats into the miniature mailbox outside, leaving gifts of toys, scratching posts, and even hand-knitted blankets. The homeowner had never intended for the cat's mansion to become a community hub, but that was exactly what it was becoming. The more the HOA pushed back, the more determined the neighborhood seemed to embrace it. Local journalists came with cameras, turning the mansion into a segment on the evening news. Headlines framed it as a story of resilience and creativity, one person standing up to needless regulation and finding joy in the process. National outlets soon picked it up as well, amplifying the tale. The HOA's board members, once used to wielding unquestioned authority, were suddenly cast as the villains in a drama they could not rewrite. Each news clip highlighted the warmth of the cats lounging in their custom-made hammocks and the coldness of an organization that had tried to ban them from their own home. As weeks passed, the mansion itself became the centerpiece of an annual neighborhood gathering that had previously been in decline. What had once been a stiff and sparsely attended HOA event transformed into a lively festival, with food trucks lining the street and musicians performing near the cul-de-sac. Visitors came from other communities just to see the mansion and take photos beside it. The cats, dressed in tiny seasonal costumes provided by neighbors, became mascots of celebration. Children giggled as they watched them play, and adults marveled at how a simple act of defiance had blossomed into something much greater. Inside the HOA, however, tempers were boiling. The board was divided between those who wanted to admit defeat and those who insisted on continuing the fight. But every attempt to legally force the mansion's removal was met with swift resistance, not just from the homeowner but from the entire community. Petitions circulated, collecting hundreds of signatures. Neighbors who had previously feared retaliation now openly voiced their support. At public meetings, attendance surged, and residents lined up to demand the HOA drop the matter entirely. It was clear the tide had turned, and the board's authority was crumbling. The climax of the conflict arrived when the homeowner, rather than retreating, leaned into the newfound fame of the cats. A professional photographer offered to create a coffee table book featuring the cats in their mansion, complete with whimsical captions and polished imagery. The book's release further fueled the story's momentum, and a portion of its proceeds was donated to local animal shelters. Suddenly, what had begun as a petty squabble over neighborhood rules was raising real money to help animals in need. The HOA's grievances now looked not only petty but cruel, as their opposition seemed aimed not just at a neighbor, but at a cause. In time, the board gave in. The HOA quietly retracted their objections, conceding that the mansion could remain so long as basic safety standards were met. They did not announce it with fanfare, nor did they apologize for the months of conflict. But everyone knew what it meant. The homeowner and their cats had won. The mansion stood as both a symbol and a monument, proof that creativity, persistence, and community support could outshine the most rigid of rules. The ending of the saga was not one of bitterness but of transformation. The neighborhood had been changed by the experience. Where once there had been suspicion, silence, and an unspoken fear of HOA authority, there was now laughter, camaraderie, and a shared sense of pride. Residents who barely knew each other before were now connected through the story of the cats. The cul-de-sac felt warmer, friendlier, and more alive. The cats themselves remained oblivious to the politics swirling around them. They continued to lounge in their hammocks, chase each other through the carved archways of their miniature mansion, and bask in the adoration of their visitors. They were, as always, content in their world, unaware of the battles that had been fought in their name. But to the humans who had witnessed it all, they were more than pets. They were icons of resilience and joy. The mansion stood through the seasons, decorated with wreaths at Christmas, strung with lights in the summer, and lined with pumpkins in the fall. It was no longer a point of contention, but a celebrated landmark. And every time someone new visited, every time a child squealed in delight at the sight of the tiny palace, the story was retold. How the HOA tried to ban the cats, and how those very cats ended up with their own mansion instead. It was a reminder that rules have limits, that community thrives when people stand together, and that sometimes the best way to win a battle is not with anger or force, but with creativity, persistence, and just a little bit of humor. The story, once rooted in frustration, concluded as a legend, a tale of how an overzealous HOA underestimated the love between a homeowner and their cats, and how that love built something unforgettable.